Don Carpenter on News Talk 1270 KIML.
News Talk 1270 KIML. Don Carpenter Show. Welcome back to the program. It's 7:08. And if you're out there on the roads, be careful. It's a little slick out there this morning. Kind of unusual for early September, but be careful. The snow should be gone by the end of the day, I think. The rain starts up, it'll melt everything. So I want to welcome to the show at this time Father Michael Fulton, and he's with Holy Resurrection Orthodox Church. And we're going to talk a little bit about Syria. And I've talked over the last few weeks, I've talked a lot about Syria and what's going on over there. And Father Fulton actually sent me an email last week, kind of reached out to me and wanted to come on and talk a little bit about the situation over there. And you've actually been to Syria, right?
Yes, I have.
So this is something I just jumped at the opportunity to actually hear from someone that has experience with this. But first, let's talk a little bit about your church and the connection that it has with Syria. I mean, this is something that goes back thousands of years, isn't it?
Yes. Not too many people would think that that here in Gillette, Wyoming, that our church would even have any type of connection to the Middle East at all, but we do. Holy Resurrection Orthodox Church is technically under the Antiochian Archdiocese, which is it has its basis in Damascus, Syria. So our patriarch, the head of our church, is in Damascus.
So, and for those that aren't really familiar with the Orthodox Church, just kind of let us know a little bit about how it's organized. I mean, it's not quite like the Catholic Church.
No, it's not quite like the Catholic Church. We don't have a pope that is the head supreme authority over the entire church. We are broken up into patriarchates, with each church having its own head. And so really it's sort of more like a confederation of churches. Most people hear a lot about Greek Orthodoxy, or they hear about Russian Orthodoxy. There's one Eastern Orthodox Church, but we all have different heads, different bishops.
Okay, so this, I think a confederacy is a good way to describe it. It's decentralized,
right?
And now, how are and this is just something that out of curiosity. I mean, how are decisions made for policy within the church? I mean, do the different patriarchs get together and make policy, or is there someone that does that?
Well, it's not like in Roman Catholicism, where the Pope has the supreme head or has supreme authority over the church. The only time any type of supreme authority could be called is when the church goes into an ecumenical council, and the church hasn't had an ecumenical council since the 700s. So we're talking, quite a long span of time.
So it really isn't like Catholicism, where things are constantly changing. I mean,
no.
It's very much like the original church.
Correct. There's a joke that says, how many Orthodox Christians does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, why do you want to change the light bulb?
Okay, well, it makes sense. So of course, now your patriarchy, you mentioned, is based in Damascus. I mean, these and I don't know why we don't hear more about this in the coverage of the conflict in Syria, but. I mean, this is the way things have been in Syria, or even before, I imagine it was even called Syria, for almost 2,000 years.
Well, we have to understand that before Syria became a quote-unquote Islamic state, which it's not, it's technically secularized, but before Syria was majorly an Islamic country with people adhering to Islam, it was Christian. It was a part of the Byzantine Empire. And So there are significant pockets of now Christian minorities in Syria.
Now, and I wouldn't expect you to know the exact number, but I mean, what percentage of the population would you say is Christian? I mean, is it a significant minority, or is it 1 or 2%? Or
it's not 1 or 2%. It is a very significant minority, perhaps even over maybe 15%.
Okay, so it's a large number of people. We're talking about a lot of people.
We're talking about a lot of people. I mean, just to give you some numbers, there's a city in Syria called Homs, which is a significant metropolitan area. Homs had over 80,000 Christians before the civil war broke out. Now they only have 400.
Well, and we've heard the same thing happening in Iraq as well. Entire cities have been just cleared of all the Christians, and I mean, I haven't heard anything. Even watching Fox News, I haven't really heard a lot about it. But I believe it was Mosul. The entire city was cleared, and they sent out pamphlets. Either convert or within 48 hours leave, or you'll be killed, and that's what we're dealing with here.
Right, and we've seen the same case in Syria. Not so much in the south. The south is predominantly Christian and Druze, whereas the north you have more of a Islamic majority. But we've seen those communities in the north in Syria where Muslims have given, or at least ISIS rather, has given Christians the choice to convert or die. And we've had cases of crucifixions, ISIS crucifying Christians. We have cases of beheadings, similar to what we've seen on the news. We've even had numerous cases of rapes and people being forced into slavery, and even people being forced into marriages, sometimes Christian girls as young as 9 and 8.
And that's just insanity. Now you've been to Syria, and let's talk about your background first. I mean, you're originally from Texas, mm-hmm. and you went to seminary, mm-hmm. and then I assume after that you spent some time in Syria, right?
Well, it was actually before I was ordained.
Okay.
While I was in Syria, while I was in seminary, rather, I went to Syria. And I went with my wife and a group of other people, and we were there for 2 weeks, just going and visiting the different holy sites there in Syria, the Christian holy sites. I mean, I got to see the place where Paul saw Christ on the road to Damascus. I saw the place where Paul was baptized in the city of Damascus, places like that. And old ancient Christian communities, for example, Malula, which is a town near Latakia in Syria, which has a significant Christian presence. And in fact, it's the only place on earth, and it's a UN heritage site. It's the only place on earth where people still speak Aramaic, the language that Jesus Christ spoke.
And again, I think it's something we don't really think about. I mean, everybody that went to Sunday school as a kid. I mean, you heard Damascus, and you don't really think about it until someone brings it up these days. But I mean, that really was the epicenter of everything that happened in the New Testament.
Precisely, and when we look on the news and we hear Syria, we normally think of Syria as a Muslim country. Well, it didn't used to be like that. And, in fact, it used to be Christian. I mean, it was a part of the Byzantine Empire, and it had a significant Christian presence. And even today, Christians have a very significant presence in the Middle East. They're often a source of a moderating force, fighting against not only tyranny, but also Wahhabist ideologies that crop up in various different parts of the Middle East.
Well, and we've seen that over the last 20 or 30 years in Lebanon.
Correct.
It's basically the same fight that was happening in Lebanon 30 years ago.
Correct. And I talked to a lot of people in town about it, and some people, they just say, wow, I didn't know that. Or, they often ask me, well, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just all leave? Well, that's very difficult, because when I was over in Syria, I spoke to a priest, And in the Orthodox Church, priests can marry. And he told me that his father was a priest, his father's father was a priest, his father's father's father was a priest, going all the way back to almost 300 years. And these are people who have lived here for over 2,000 years. These are people who weren't just converted by Christian missionaries. These are the original, or the descendants of the people who converted when the apostles first told them about Jesus Christ. So to ask them to leave their heritage, to leave 2,000 years of history, it's difficult.
Well, and to transpose that to the American experience, that would be, and this happened in our history, that would be the same as asking the Native Americans to leave their land. And we look back at that now and say, well, that was a horrible thing to do. That's what is going on in Syria right now. I mean, you can't just ask people that have been in that area for 3,000 or 2,000 years to just pack up and leave. I mean, it's not right.
Right. When I was in Sueda, which is a town in the south, I went to a home of a Christian family that their home was over 600 years old. The family had lived there for 600 years. The house was older than our own government. So it was awe-inspiring, but at the same time, asking them to leave that would be horrible.
Well, and it's not like during this last several hundred years, last 1,000 years even. Muslims and Christians have lived side by side in that area for a long time. I mean, I'm sure there have been conflicts over the years, but this is something different.
Right. Syria actually has a very unique position in the Middle East in that it's one of the only secularized states. And what I mean by secularized is that they don't follow, at least the government of Bashar al-Assad does not follow any type of Wahhabist agenda. I mean, we look at Saudi Arabia and they're a monarchy, but they're a religious monarchy, almost a theocracy. Or we look at Iran, which is technically an Islamic republic. So Syria has a very unique position. Also, Syria has a unique position in that many of these minorities, whether they be Christians or Orthodox Christians or Catholics, because Syria does have several Catholic communities, or even Yazidi or Druze, they have a say in government. And I think the reason for that is because Bashar al-Assad is a minority himself. Most people in Syria are either Sunni or Shia. Bashar al-Assad is an Alawi, which is a offshoot of Shia Islam. And his group is a lot smaller than even Christians. So he realizes that he needs to at least share power with other minorities. Otherwise, his own minority group could be basically killed off. Well,
and this is not condoning a lot of the things that Assad has done.
No, of course not.
He's been a brutal dictator, but as I mentioned to you off the air, sometimes it's better to have someone like that in power than an unpredictable caliphate like we're seeing now.
Right, precisely. What we see right now is Saudi Arabia with its hands involved in a lot of things. And Saudi Arabia is predominantly responsible for funding these groups like ISIS, mostly because Saudi Arabia wants to maintain a hegemony over that area, and also because Syria is allied with Saudi Arabia's number one enemy, and our number one enemy as well, Iran.
Well, now I imagine the powers that be in Saudi Arabia also don't mind a little bit of unrest in that area, just because, and it keeps oil prices up. I mean, and any kind of unrest, any kind of uncertainty. I mean, all we have to see is just go to the gas pump. And every time there's a big event in the Middle East, prices go up, and that benefits Saudi Arabia.
Right. It's interesting that just last week, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia came on the news, or at least their news agency in Saudi Arabia, and essentially told the United States that they were ISIS's next target. And so this may, I don't know, if had some sort of hand in maybe sort of pushing our involvement into this sphere. So do you think that that there might be a little bit of manipulation going on there? I've been hearing for the last 20 years that we need to cut ties with Saudi Arabia. We need to cut ties with Saudi Arabia. Do you think that there's a bit of manipulation going on that Saudi Arabia could be the ultimate backer of all of this? I don't know if they're the ultimate backer of all this, but I think that they do have their hand involved in a lot of goings on in Syria and in Iraq, especially with ISIS. We have to understand that the Saudis follow a philosophy of Islam known as Wahhabism, which is a very extreme interpretation of Islam. It's very, very militant. It is very, very conservative, and I don't use conservative politically, but conservative in a religious sense, and even far more conservative. It's extreme. Women are not allowed to drive. Women have to remain covered. Punishments are carried out through beheadings. Their constitution legally is the Quran, the holy book of Islam. And so this is sort of ISIS's goal as well. They want to create a sort of Islamic monarchy, a caliphate, if you will, in Syria and Iraq.
Well, and I've heard I've heard a lot of talk of this caliph, the guy that's running ISIS, and I hear talk that maybe decapitating ISIS by taking out one guy is it would work, but I don't think just taking out the caliph would work. I mean, this is a widespread regional belief system, isn't it?
It is, and it's. I don't think that taking out one single person is going to affect this. In fact, I think it would actually create sort of a Hydra effect. You cut off one head and more heads spring up.
Well, and again, I'm not quite sure, and I'm not an expert on this, but it seems like the more that you do, I mean, I'm sure this guy has a cult of personality around him, but it almost seems like sometimes making martyrs of the big guys ends up backfiring a little bit.
Right, and really the victim in all of this are Christian minorities, which they're sort of the unsung victims, at least in our media and even by our government. For example, just a few weeks ago, the government had mentioned Yazidis taking up arms and fighting, and that we were going to support Yazidi minorities. Well, the Yazidis are only a handful in Iraq and Syria. There aren't that many Yazidis compared to Christians in the Middle East.
Well, now, are there Christians that are taking up arms and trying to fight back against ISIS in Syria?
Yes. There have been Christians who have sort of formed up militias in various different towns. I know that in Sueda, the town that I spent most of my time in, which has a significant Christian Druze population, Christians and Druze have sort of band together to take up arms against ISIS, to fight alongside the Syrian Republic Army, which is Bashar al-Assad's army. Also, in a town called Ma'urda, which is predominantly Christian, the town's people there have even taken up arms. And I think they've even taped some of their victories on YouTube. They've often, we've talked a lot about in the media about ISIS using social media in order to attract people or to gain followers. But even Christians and other minorities are fighting back as well by putting their stuff up on YouTube and Facebook that they're here to stay.
Well, and I think that's an interesting strategy, because even if the mainstream media here in America isn't reporting about the Christian minorities in Syria, that information is out there. Sometimes you might have to look a little bit, but the information is out there to be had. It
is out there to be had, but the majority of people get their news from major news affiliates, and it's just surprising that even the most conservative news affiliates, like especially Fox News, and I'm a news junkie, I haven't heard hardly anything about, or any major story or major sort of puff piece about Christians in Syria.
And again, I'm kind of a news junkie like that as well. I mean, I heard stories about Christians in Iraq, but I really haven't heard much about Syria. I really haven't. Now, are the Christians in Iraq, are they mainly the same patriarchy, or do they have their own?
They're if they're Orthodox Christians, they are under the same patriarchy as us. Now, there are different Christian groups in Syria. I mean, you've got Maronites, which are connected to the Roman Catholic Church, and then you have Latin Rite, Roman Catholics as well as Syriac Orthodox and a few other groups as well. So it's not just all Orthodox Christians.
Okay. So there are a lot of different groups.
Right.
I mean, how are they working? Are they working together against this threat?
Well, they are. Just a few years ago, two bishops, one from the Syriac Orthodox, which is separate from my church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, their archbishop and one of our metropolitans got together to go to a conference to talk about Christian unity, and in the midst of all this turmoil that was just beginning to brew up, and they were actually kidnapped by ISIS, and they're still held hostage, and this has been over a year now.
And that is. And again, it does kind of go to show that this has been going on for a while. I mean, the first we heard of ISIS was probably maybe the beginning of this year. I mean, even a year ago, we were talking about helping the anti-Assad rebels, which turned out to be ISIS.
They turned out to be ISIS. Smack dab ISIS.
And I'm glad the American people kind of saw through that, because. It is interesting to compare the support for those actions with the support for going after ISIS. I mean, 9% versus 65%. I'm glad the American people saw through, and that's not to say that we like Assad, but it certainly is better than what we're seeing now.
Well, the media trumped this up, and this went on a few years back with the so-called Arab Spring, where the media created this sort of black and white narrative of rebel freedom fighters versus angry, evil dictators. Well, the righteous rebel fighters turned out to be extremists. They turned out to be ISIS.
And again, I'm not quite sure. I guess people that don't really pay attention to the news as much, might have fallen for that. I saw it in the beginning. I mean, all you have to do is watch the videos of these so-called rebels, especially in Egypt. I mean, they were saying all the same things that you hear from ISIS these days.
Right, and it's almost ironic. There have been people on Facebook, Syrians, who have either fought in the Syrian rebel army or even in these militia groups where they've either captured ISIS insurgents or they've killed them, and they often take pictures of their weapons and whatnot. And I saw the other day and it was funny. It was a picture of a rifle that an ISIS insurgent was wielded before he was captured, and it said property of the United States government.
Oh yeah, well, and even though we didn't go full out with the support of ISIS about a year ago. We did sell some small arms. I mean,
Right.
I probably think everything up to like 50 caliber. So small arms, not no howitzers or anything like that. But somehow they got some of that stuff as well. Right. And I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how all of this happened, but we seem to have messed this one up pretty bad. Now, and again, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about what you think would be the answer to this. Actually, before we get to that, why don't we take a call and. News Talk 1270, you're on the air.
Hey, good morning. I'm really interested in what's going on there. I follow that all that stuff as much as I can. What I'm curious about, and I really like the idea of the Christians banding together over there to fight ISIS, but how do they tell the ISIS? They aren't uniformed. The ISIS people aren't uniformed, are they? I mean, how does a militia tell when there's an ISIS person in their midst?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I mean, this is basically urban warfare between groups of they're not uniformed, they're not official armies. I mean, how can you tell the difference?
I'm not too sure on the details. I know that we've seen pictures on Facebook and even in the news of ISIS insurgents, and they usually dress in very traditional Islamic garb, and they tend to follow the tradition of keeping beards and shaving the mustache, which is prescribed in the Hadith. So I suppose that's one way to tell them apart. But other than that, often in urban warfare, it's very hard.
Well, yeah, and I would also imagine they would have certain strongholds. They know which areas are held by ISIS. So I imagine if you've lived in that area your entire life, it's probably not hard to figure out. It would be like us trying to spot a New Yorker.
Precisely, and when. In Syria, when you have such close ties to everybody, where people track down their families down to their cousin's cousin's cousin, it's pretty easy, I think.
Okay, so the question I was going to ask you before, and then this is something I know it's probably not an easy answer, but. What do you think is the final way that we can that we can stop this threat?
That is a very difficult answer, and it's a political one. And as someone who is a member of the religious community, that's very difficult for me. But as a U.S. citizen, as a taxpayer, and as a voter, I think that. Getting away from our involvement from Saudi Arabia would definitely help. This is sort of a little bit of history repeating, because if you look, from the 1970s on, we started this with Saudi Arabia with the whole security for oil by supporting them in exchange for decent oil prices. And we look at the Afghan Soviet war, where we supported the Mujahideen with arms and weapons to fight the Soviets in order to sort of assert our authority in that area. Well, they eventually drew the Soviets out, of course, but the Mujahideen turned into the Taliban. And so this is sort of very similar to what happened back in the 80s.
Well, and it's pretty easy to single out the parts of the world where this Wahhabist idealism is prominent. I mean, it's Saudi Arabia. It's the areas held by ISIS in Syria. I mean, it's pretty easy to figure out who to not be involved with, and I mean, obviously, at this point, I think maybe some kind of support for the forces fighting against ISIS is necessary, but like you said, the eventual answer is going to be something political and not supporting the backers of this.
Right. Syria, again, has a very unique position. It was very unique in the Middle East. When I went into Syria, I first had to stop into Dubai. And Dubai, like Saudi Arabia, has very, very stringent rules. Not as stringent as Saudi Arabia, but very stringent rules on what people can do and what people can't do. For example, it's almost unheard of going to a restaurant or sitting out in the open and having a beer or a glass of wine in Dubai or Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, it's totally illegal. But in Syria, I could go to a restaurant, I could order a glass of wine and sit there and drink it with my wife. And there are Muslims, Christians, and no one had a problem with that.
Not have to worry about being arrested by the Sharia police.
Right. My wife went through the country pretty much uncovered, and it was just a different atmosphere compared to Saudi Arabia.
Well, and I think that's what a lot of people don't really realize is the Middle East isn't all like Saudi Arabia, where women can't drive and they have to cover all of their skin. There are parts of the Middle East that are fairly westernized.
Right, and Syria is one of them. Syria, Lebanon, and of course Israel. Those are the three countries that really, at least in my mind, it brings things to mind. I remember talking to an Iraqi who went to my home parish back in Houston, Texas, and he was telling me that he remembers, life in Iraq back in the 60s and 70s, where people were listening to Motown and girls were dancing the twist, and it was, you didn't have any of this extremism.
And again, it seems like we could get to that point again, but it's going to take a lot of hard work. And the first step is making sure people understand how things have been in the past and could be again in the future.
Right, and education is the key in getting people to know. One of the things that I was told everywhere when I went to Syria, even by Muslims, when they asked me where I came from, and I was a bit hesitant to say that I was an American because I was afraid that I might receive any type, some sort of repercussion or abuse. And I finally told them, in Arabic, "Ana Amriki," I'm an American. And they smiled and they stepped back and they said, "Welcome to Syria. I hope that more Americans will come to Syria." They really don't have this bias against us. And that's one day I hope that one day Americans will be able to visit Syria again.
And I think that's, and I know we have to get you out of here. I think that's a good place to end. But if anybody's interested and maybe they want to learn more about the history of your church or anything, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, the best thing to do is to check out our website at www.holyresurrectiongillette.org, or show up for Divine Liturgy on Sunday, and it's at 10 a.m. And we have our church at 610 South Kendrick Avenue.
And I want to thank you for stopping by. I mean, this really has been enlightening. I mean, I think it's very important that we understand exactly what's going on, and this is the stuff we haven't been hearing from anyone else. So I just want to thank you so much for stopping by and taking a few minutes to talk with us this morning, and hopefully we can talk to you again soon. Sure. Thanks for having me on. Okay. Thank you very much. That's Father Michael Fulton, Holy Resurrection Orthodox Church. Again, Holy Resurrection Gillette.org. And with that, we're going to take a short break. Actually, this will probably take us to the top of the hour. We ran a little long, but I wanted to make sure we didn't break that one up. News Talk 1270, KIML.
You're listening to Don Carpenter on Gillette's Heritage Station. News Talk 1270, KIML. 1270, KIML.